Judge William Harrison adjusted his black robes as he settled into his worn leather chair in courtroom 12 of the Manhattan Municipal Court. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. At 62, with graying temples and stern blue eyes, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had overseen thousands of cases. This particular Monday morning felt heavier than usual. His wife Martha's words from breakfast still echoed in his mind. Their adopted daughter Sarah had officially dropped out of medical school to follow her passion for fashion instead. The news had sparked a heated argument between father and daughter, ending with Sarah storming out of their weekly Sunday dinner. "All those years of preparation wasted," he muttered, shuffling through the day's docket. The morning schedule appeared routine: a few traffic violations, parking tickets, and minor civil disputes. Judge Harrison took pride in running an efficient courtroom, often dispensing justice with swift, sometimes harsh, decisions. His clerk, James, who had worked with him for over 15 years, noticed the judge's tense shoulders and furrowed brow. "Rough weekend, Your Honor?" he asked quietly while arranging the case files. "Nothing I can't handle, James," Harrison replied curtly, his tone making it clear he didn't wish to discuss personal matters. The clock struck 9 a.m., and the bailiff called the court to order. The first few cases proceeded as expected: nervous drivers explaining away speeding tickets, a dispute over a fender bender, and a contested parking violation. Harrison handled each with his characteristic efficiency, though his mood grew increasingly irritable with each excuse he heard. Just before the morning break, the bailiff called out, "Case number 2374, City of Manhattan vs. Williams, parking violation." A young black woman in a navy pantsuit approached the podium. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with natural hair neatly styled and carrying a warm leather briefcase. Judge Harrison glanced at her briefly, then at the citation. "You're here for parking in a loading zone on Fifth Avenue, correct?" he asked, his tone already dismissive. He had seen countless similar cases, and his patience was particularly thin that day. "Actually, Your Honor," the woman began, her voice clear and confident, "I'm here representing Ms. Williams." She placed her briefcase on the table with practiced ease. Harrison raised an eyebrow, looking at her over his reading glasses. His lip curled slightly as he asked, "And you are?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. "Sandra Thompson, Your Honor, from Mitchell and Associates." She withdrew several documents from her briefcase, her movements precise and professional. "Very well, Miss Thompson," Harrison said, emphasizing her name with a hint of skepticism. "Though it seems like overkill to bring an attorney for a simple parking ticket, let's get this over with." Little did Judge Harrison know that this seemingly routine case would shake the very foundations of his carefully ordered world, forcing him to confront his own deeply held prejudices and revealing a connection that would change his life forever. As Sandra Thompson prepared to present her case, the morning sunlight caught the silver locket around her neck, identical to the one Harrison had given his daughter, Sarah, on her 16th birthday. Though he was too preoccupied with his own assumptions to notice, this detail was crucial. Sandra Thompson stood confidently at the podium, her posture reflecting years of courtroom experience. She pulled out a manila folder containing photographs of the loading zone where her client, Ms. Williams, had received the ticket. Judge Harrison watched with growing irritation as she methodically arranged her evidence. "Your Honor," Sandra began, her voice steady and professional. "My client was ticketed at 2:15 p.m. on March 15th for allegedly parking in a loading zone. However, the signage in question was obscured by construction scaffolding at the time of the incident." She held up a time-stamped photograph showing the partially hidden sign. Judge Harrison cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Miss Thompson, are you suggesting that your client shouldn't be held responsible for following basic parking regulations just because she claims she couldn't see a sign?" His tone dripped with condescension. Several observers in the gallery exchanged uncomfortable glances. The judge's dismissive attitude was becoming increasingly apparent, even to the court reporter who had worked with him for years. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Sandra continued, maintaining her composure, "according to Municipal Code Section 4.23, proper sign visibility is a requirement for enforcement. I have here a precedent from Torres versus City of Manhattan, 2019, which addresses a similar situation. Miss Thompson, Harrison interrupted again, his face slightly flushed. I'm quite familiar with the municipal code. I've been presiding over these cases since before you were probably in law school. He shuffled the papers on his desk, barely glancing at the evidence she was trying to present. Sandra straightened her spine, her brown eyes meeting the judge's stern gaze. Your Honor, I graduated summa cum laude from Columbia Law in 2015, and I've successfully argued 17 similar cases in this very courtroom. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. Something about her demeanor caught Harrison's attention, her head tilt when making a point, the slight gesture of her right hand. These mannerisms seemed oddly familiar, for a brief moment reminding him of Sarah, but he quickly dismissed the thought. Furthermore, Sandra continued, pulling out additional documentation, I have statements from 3 construction workers confirming that the scaffolding was erected the previous day, without proper notice to local businesses or residents. Judge Harrison felt a growing unease as he watched her methodically present her case. There was something about her that he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the silver locket catching the morning light or the determined set of her jaw that mirrored his own daughter's expressions. The bailiff approached with a note from the clerk, and as Harrison read it, his face paled slightly. The note contained information about Sandra Thompson's background. She had been raised in the same neighborhood as his adopted daughter, Sarah, and their ages matched exactly. The courtroom suddenly felt uncomfortably warm as Harrison realized this case was becoming far more complicated than a simple parking violation. But he wasn't ready to confront the implications of what he was beginning to suspect. Instead, he gripped his gavel tighter, determined to maintain control of his courtroom even as his personal biases and past decisions began to unravel. Sandra Thompson methodically arranged her exhibits on the podium, while Judge Harrison watched with barely concealed impatience. The morning sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows highlighted the tension in the air as she prepared to present her case. Your Honor, Sandra began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had argued hundreds of cases, I would like to present evidence that demonstrates why my client's parking ticket should be dismissed. She held up a series of time-stamped photographs, each one carefully labeled and organized. Harrison leaned back in his chair, making no effort to hide his skepticism. Miss Thompson, surely you don't expect the court to spend valuable time examining photographs for a simple parking violation? Sandra remained unfazed. Your Honor, these photographs establish a clear timeline of events that prove my client's innocence. She stepped forward, the silver locket catching the light. If you'll examine Exhibit 3, you'll notice the construction permit was issued after my client received her citation. As she spoke, her legal argument unfolded with surgical precision. She cited 3 relevant precedents, each perfectly applicable to the case. Her knowledge of the municipal code was impressive, and her presentation style flawless. The gallery, usually half asleep during minor traffic cases, found themselves drawn into her argument. Even the court reporter paused occasionally, impressed by her articulation and command of legal terminology. Furthermore, Sandra continued, presenting her final exhibit, I have surveillance footage from the nearby bank showing the exact moment the construction crew covered the sign. This footage is time-stamped and verified by the bank's security department. The courtroom fell silent as she concluded her presentation. Even Judge Harrison had to admit privately that her defense was one of the most well-prepared he'd seen in years, regardless of the case's significance. And finally, Your Honor, Sandra said, her voice carrying a note of quiet authority, I would like to cite the recent case of Martinez versus City Planning Department, where Judge Alina Rodriguez ruled that obscured signage constitutes a violation of due process under similar circumstances. As she finished, Judge Harrison realized he had severely underestimated both the case and the attorney before him. What he had dismissed as a simple parking ticket had become a masterclass in municipal law and civil rights protection. Little did he know, this brilliant legal presentation was just the beginning of a revelation that would shake his world to its core. Judge Harrison sat frozen in his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of his desk. The revelation hit him like a physical blow as he studied Sandra Thompson's face more carefully. The familiar gestures, the determined set of her jaw, and most notably, the silver locket around her neck. It wasn't just similar to Sarah's, it was identical. His mind raced back to 18 years ago, when he and Martha had adopted Sarah. They knew she had a biological sister, but the details were vague. The adoption agency had mentioned that the girls had been separated, one going to a foster family, the other put up for direct adoption. Sarah had received her locket on her 16th birthday, but Harrison now remembered Martha mentioning that it was actually a family heirloom, one of 2 matching pieces that their biological mother had left for her daughters. As Sandra continued presenting her case, Harrison barely heard her words. Instead, he found himself noticing all the similarities between this accomplished attorney and his daughter. The same determined chin, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, even the habit of tapping her right foot when making an important point. "Your Honor," Sandra's voice cut through his thoughts. "Are you feeling all right?" Harrison realized he had been staring. The entire courtroom had fallen silent, waiting for his response to her latest legal argument. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. I apologize, Miss Thompson. Would you mind repeating your last statement?" As she began speaking again, Harrison discreetly signaled his clerk, James, to approach the bench. "Get me the Thompson file," he whispered urgently, "and contact Martha immediately." James returned moments later with a manila envelope and a hastily scribbled note from Martha. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he read his wife's confirmation. Sandra Thompson was born Sandra Mitchell, Sarah's biological sister. She was placed in foster care, while Sarah was adopted. Both girls had received matching lockets from their birth mother. The weight of his earlier actions came crashing down on him. How many times had he dismissed people based on their appearance? How many times had his biases influenced his decisions? Now, standing before him was not just any attorney, but his daughter's sister, a woman he had treated with thinly veiled contempt just moments before. Looking up, Harrison saw Sandra in a new light. Her professional demeanor, her excellent preparation, her Ivy League education. She had accomplished all of this despite her early life circumstances, and he, the judge sworn to uphold justice, had nearly dismissed her abilities due to his own prejudices. The irony wasn't lost on him. While his adopted daughter Sarah had recently chosen to pursue law against his wishes, her biological sister had already become the kind of attorney he had always respected, or should have respected if his biases hadn't clouded his judgment. "Miss Thompson," he finally spoke, his voice slightly hoarse. "The court will need to take a brief recess. We will resume in 15 minutes. He quickly rose and retreated to his chambers, leaving a confused courtroom behind. Once alone, Harrison sank into his chair, staring at the family photo on his desk. Sarah's smiling face looked back at him. He picked up his phone, his hand still trembling, and dialed Martha's number. As it rang, he caught his reflection in the window, a man who had prided himself on fairness and sound judgment now forced to confront the reality that he had nearly let his prejudices affect the course of justice again. "Martha," he said when she answered, "I've made a mistake." Martha's voice trembled as she spoke. "William, I've pulled out Sarah's adoption records. There's no doubt that Sandra Thompson is her biological sister. The birth certificates, the dates, even their mother's name matches." Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, his desk, usually pristine, now scattered with papers, adoption records, court documents, and an old photograph of 2 small girls wearing matching lockets that Martha had just sent him. His hand shook as he studied the picture. The younger girl was unmistakably Sarah, and the older one, with the same determined expression he had just seen in court, was Sandra. "Martha, how did we not know?" he whispered. "All these years, and she's been practicing law here in Manhattan. We chose to have a closed adoption, remember?" Martha replied gently. Sandra was already 7 when she went into foster care. Sarah was only 4. The agency told us it would be better to keep them separated to give Sarah a fresh start. A knock at the chamber door interrupted their conversation. "Your Honor," James, his clerk, called out. The 15-minute recess is almost over. The courtroom is waiting. William's voice was low. I'm coming. Martha, he said quickly before hanging up. Sarah's on her way to the courthouse. I had to tell her. She deserves to know. Harrison felt the weight of 2 decades of decisions pressing down on him. He thought of all the times Sarah had asked about her biological family and how he had dismissed her questions, insisting that they were her only real family. Now, her sister had been standing in his courtroom, and he had treated her with the same prejudice he claimed to oppose. Returning to the bench, Harrison found the courtroom unusually quiet. Sandra Thompson stood at her podium, still professional but with a subtle tension in her shoulders. She had no idea the truth was about to change her life. Miss Thompson, Harrison began, his voice no longer condescending. Before we proceed, there is a matter of significant importance that must be addressed. He paused, searching for the right words. I find myself in a position where I must recuse myself from this case. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Sandra's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Your Honor, may I ask the reason for this sudden recusal? Just then, the courtroom doors burst open, and Sarah Harrison, still wearing her medical school lab coat, rushed in. She stopped dead when she saw Sandra, her hand instinctively reaching for the silver locket around her neck, the twin to the one Sandra wore. Sandra turned at the commotion, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. 2 women wearing identical lockets stared at each other across the courtroom. Recognition dawned in Sandra's eyes as she looked from Sarah to the judge and back again. Order. Harrison called out softly, though no one was making a sound. The entire courtroom held its breath. Miss Thompson, Sarah, Harrison said, I believe there's a conversation that's been 18 years in the making. Sandra's professional composure cracked slightly as she looked at her locket and then at Sarah's. You're my sister, she whispered, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Mom, Martha, she showed me the pictures this morning. We've been looking for you for years, but all the records were sealed. Judge Harrison watched as 2 decades of separation began to crumble in his courtroom. The wall of prejudice he had built, the assumptions he had made, the biases he had carried, all fell away as he witnessed the reunion of 2 sisters, one of whom he had raised and the other he had nearly dismissed just hours before. Court is adjourned for the day, he announced, his voice thick with emotion. Miss Thompson's client's case will be reassigned to Judge Meyer. He paused, looking at both women. I believe there are more important matters that need attention right now. Judge William Harrison sat alone in his study late that evening, a glass of untouched scotch on his desk, surrounded by case files from the past 5 years. After the emotional scene in the courtroom, he had excused himself, allowing Sarah and Sandra time to reconnect in the courthouse cafe. Martha had joined them, leaving him to grapple with his thoughts and actions. He pulled out case after case, reviewing his decisions with new eyes. Each ruling, each interaction now seemed tainted with the possibility of unconscious bias. The weight of his position and the impact of his decisions had never felt so heavy. His computer screen displayed Sandra Thompson's impressive legal record, dozens of cases won, numerous commendations from legal associations, glowing recommendations from colleagues. He had nearly dismissed all of this based on a momentary prejudgment. Dad. Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, still wearing her lab coat, her eyes red from crying. We need to talk. Harrison gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, the chair where he had lectured her countless times about her life choices. This time, however, he remained silent, waiting for his daughter to speak. Sandra told me about how you treated her in court today, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. Before you knew who she was, she said she's faced that kind of treatment throughout her career, but she didn't expect it from a judge of your reputation. The words hit him like physical blows. Harrison closed his eyes, remembering his dismissive tone, his barely concealed contempt. I've made terrible mistakes, Sarah, he admitted quietly. It's not just about today, Dad, Sarah continued. Remember when I first mentioned switching from medicine to law? You said I was throwing away my potential. When you look at Sandra, she's everything you ever wanted in a lawyer. She's brilliant, prepared, professional, yet you couldn't see past your own prejudices. Harrison opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a worn leather journal, his record of personal thoughts on significant cases. I've been reviewing my past rulings, he said, his voice heavy. How many lives have I affected because I couldn't see past my own biases? How many Sandra Thompsons have stood before me, deserving fair treatment, but receiving less? Sarah leaned forward, placing her hand over her father's. Sandra doesn't hate you, you know, she said. She's seen judges like you change over time. But, Dad, you need to do more than just feel guilty. You need to make real changes. The judge nodded slowly, reaching for a legal pad. With determined handwriting, he began writing. First thing tomorrow, I'm requesting a complete review of my past cases involving minority defendants and lawyers. I'm also going to recommend mandatory bias training for all court personnel, starting with myself. And what about Sandra? Sarah asked softly. What about our family? Harrison looked at the family photo on his desk, taken just last Christmas. There was an empty space next to Sarah that now seemed glaringly obvious. I owe her more than just an apology, he said. I owe her the respect she's earned as a lawyer and the love she deserves as family. But first, I need to earn her trust. Sarah stood up, straightening her lab coat. Sandra and Mom are having dinner at that Italian place around the corner. She's staying in town for a few days, too, to get to know us. It's not too late to join us, Dad, to start making things right. Judge Harrison looked at his reflection in the window, no longer seeing the confident, unmovable pillar of justice he had always imagined himself to be, but rather a man in need of growth and change. He stood up, removed his judicial robe, and reached for his coat. Sometimes, he said quietly, following Sarah out of the study, justice requires us to face our own injustice first. The small Italian restaurant, Bellin, buzzed with its usual evening crowd, but at a corner table, an extraordinary reunion was taking place. Martha Harrison sat between her daughter Sarah and Sandra Thompson, their matching lockets catching the soft candlelight as they leaned in, sharing stories and filling in 18 years of separation. I can't believe you became a lawyer, Sarah said, wiping tears from her eyes. I just decided to switch to law school, and here you are already living my dream. She reached out to touch Sandra's hand, still amazed by their connection. Sandra smiled, her professional demeanor softening in the warm atmosphere. I always felt drawn to fighting for justice, she explained, twirling pasta on her fork. Growing up in foster care, I saw how the system could fail people. I wanted to make a difference. Martha watched the sisters interact, noting their similar mannerisms, the way they both tucked their hair behind their ears when emotional, how they gestured with their right hands while speaking. Sandra, she said gently, I hope you know we never meant to keep you apart. Sandra interrupted kindly. Different times, different decisions. I'm just grateful we found each other now. She glanced at the restaurant entrance. Though, I admit I'm surprised Judge Harrison isn't here. Just then, the restaurant door opened, and William Harrison walked in. Harrison stood there, appearing more uncertain than he ever had in his courtroom. He held a small wrapped package in his hands, and his usual confident posture had given way to something more humble. The table fell silent as he walked forward. Sarah squeezed Sandra's hand supportively, while Martha gave her husband an encouraging nod. Sandra, Harrison began, his voice thick with emotion, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you 18 years of being the father you deserved. He placed the package on the table. This isn't a way to make up for lost time, but perhaps it's a start. Sandra carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a leather-bound law journal from 1995, the year she and Sarah were separated. Inside the cover was a handwritten note. To my newfound daughter, whose strength and dedication to justice has taught me more in one day than my decades on the bench. I spent the afternoon reviewing my past cases, Harrison continued, still standing. Your presence in my courtroom today didn't just reunite our family, it opened my eyes to my own failings as a judge and as a human being. Sandra gestured to the empty chair beside her. Please sit, Dad. The word felt foreign on her tongue, but somehow right. I've faced prejudice my entire career, Sandra said, but today wasn't just about that. Today was about family finding each other despite all odds. As Harrison sat down, a waiter appeared with additional place settings and a bottle of wine. Martha reached for her husband's hand under the table, squeezing it supportively. "Tell us about your childhood," Sarah urged. "I want to know everything. Who raised you? When did you decide to become a lawyer? Do you have any family of your own?" Sandra smiled as she shared stories about her foster parents, the dedicated teachers who encouraged her dreams, and her journey through law school. Harrison listened intently, his heart heavy with the realization of all the moments he had missed. "I never married," Sandra revealed. "My work became my life, but I always felt something was missing." She touched her locket. "This was my only connection to my past, to you, Sarah. I wore it every day, hoping somehow it would lead me back to my sister." As the evening progressed, the initial awkwardness melted away. They ordered dessert, shared photographs from their phones, and began the delicate process of weaving two separate lives into one family tapestry. Before they parted that night, Harrison made a promise, not just to Sandra and Sarah, but to himself. "From this day forward," he declared, "our family will be whole, and my courtroom will be a place where justice truly is blind to everything except the facts and the law." Sandra hugged him then, a gesture that brought tears to the stern judge's eyes. "That's all any of us can ask for," she whispered. "A chance to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday." 6 months after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Judge William Harrison's court had undergone a remarkable transformation. Gone was the stern, unapproachable figure who had ruled with bias-tinted glasses. In his place sat a changed man, one who had learned the hardest lesson of his career through personal experience. On this particular morning, Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing his latest initiative, a comprehensive diversity training program for all courthouse staff. On his desk sat a framed photograph from last month's family dinner, Sarah and Sandra flanking him at his birthday celebration, all three wearing matching smiles. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, looking up to see Sandra entering, dressed in her usual impeccable courtroom attire. "Good morning, Dad," she said, the word now flowing naturally after months of family bonding. "I brought those case studies you requested for the judicial bias workshop." She placed a thick folder on his desk. Harrison smiled, remembering how their relationship had evolved from that tense morning in his courtroom.
"Thank you, Sandra."
"How's Sarah doing with her first semester of law school?" "She's thriving," Sandra beamed. "Actually, she's shadowing me next week for her practical experience requirement." "Who would have thought both your daughters would end up in law?" The judge chuckled, but his expression soon turned serious. "Sandra, I wanted to show you something." He pulled out a stack of case reviews. "I've gone through every ruling I've made in the past 5 years. The patterns of bias were disturbing." Sandra sat down, her expression soft. "What matters is what you're doing now, Dad. The mentorship program you started for minority law students, the bias training, the community outreach. You're making real changes." "Because of you," he admitted. "That day in court, you didn't just win your case. You opened my eyes to my own prejudices." He gestured to the courthouse outside his window. "Now, every time I put on these robes, I remember that justice truly must be blind." Just then, Sarah burst into the chambers, her law books clutched to her chest. "Dad, Sandra, you won't believe what happened in constitutional law today." She stopped when she noticed their serious expressions. "Am I interrupting something?" "Never," Harrison said warmly, making room at his desk. "Your sister was just helping me with a new training program." Sarah dropped her books and pulled out her phone. "Mom wanted me to remind you both about Sunday dinner. She's making her famous lasagna, and she won't take no for an answer." The three of them shared a laugh, remembering how Martha had taken to organizing weekly family dinners, determined to make up for lost time. The family photo wall at home now included childhood pictures of both sisters, carefully collected from Sandra's foster family. "Before you both go," Harrison said, pulling out a document, "I wanted to share something else. The state Supreme Court has approved our proposal for a task force on judicial bias." They want me to head it, but I told them it needs to be a joint leadership. He looked at Sandra. I recommended you as co-chair. Sandra's eyes widened. Dad, that's incredible. But are you sure? Some of your colleagues might. Harrison interrupted firmly. Who better to lead this initiative than someone who has experienced bias firsthand and fought against it with dignity and excellence? Sarah hugged her sister excitedly. This is amazing. My sister and Dad working together to change the system. As they discussed the details, Harrison watched his daughters interact. One he had raised from childhood, the other he had found through a twist of fate. Their presence in his life had transformed not just his family, but his entire approach to justice. You know, he said thoughtfully, sometimes the greatest lessons come from our biggest mistakes. 6 months ago, I was a judge who thought he knew everything about justice. Today, I'm still learning, and that's exactly how it should be. As the afternoon sun filtered through his chamber windows, Judge William Harrison looked at his daughters with pride, knowing that his legacy would not just be the cases he decided, but the changes he helped create in the pursuit of true justice for all.